Originally, I was just going to write about one aspect of the Diddy case that I thought was interesting, which was his relationship with the supermodel Naomi Campbell, mainly because I had sort of gone down this avenue of research with respect to my work on Jeffrey Epstein that I hadn't published yet, involving her and Epstein. And so I thought it would be interesting to explore how she sort of intersects both worlds. But then, in doing that, kind of realized there were more intersections to be had. Including the current president, among other figures, Ron Burkle being another one. So it seemed worth exploring at least that broader network. And, a lot of the people, oligarch figures that pop up in my book, the Bronfman family, for example, had an outsized influence on the record industry and on hip hop in the 1990s and beyond. And some of that intersects with other aspects of my Epstein research that I sort of explore with my co-author, CZ Means, at the end of, this first article. Hopefully it'll be a 3-part series, but, sometimes these things run a little long. We tend to do long form journalism at Unlimited Hangout anyway, so it might be more than 3, but some of my past stuff sort of on things that were going on in the 1990s in the world of covert ops, sort of linking some of this unusual activity in the hip hop industry with allegations made by Gary Webb in his Dark Alliance series, and some of this, what I wrote about in my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, about Epstein's apparent involvement in arms trafficking during the first Clinton administration, what his 17 visits to the Clinton White House were about, and, why he had assisted on behalf of his, main patron, Leslie Wexner, relocating the Southern Air Transport airline, which had previously been CIA owned and had been the main Iran-Contra airline that had been involved in drug and arms trafficking for the benefit of the Contras in Nicaragua, how that was sort of repurposed in this period and sort of had teamed up with these corrupt actors in China's military industrial complex to basically flood urban America with illegal assault weapons, which is not really something that gets talked about a lot, but I've always thought is a pretty important piece of the puzzle in talking about, this alleged effort that's touched on here of sort of engineering a cultural shift for the purpose of for the benefit of the private prison industry. And so there's an exploration of that as it relates to Diddy. But basically, in a nutshell, the interest in the Diddy case was similar to my interest in the Epstein case initially, in that, the way the media narrative is about these cases is sort of, very focused on either Diddy or Epstein, and like they were the mastermind of all of this stuff. And these people never exist in a vacuum. They tend to have significant moneyed benefactors that somehow evade persecution or even investigation. That's very obvious in the Epstein case, but I think it's also pretty true as it relates to, the Diddy case as well. And he learned this behavior that he's now, in prison for and awaiting trial for from, various other figures that have somehow evaded the kind of charges that now face Diddy. And why is that? So the series is meant to sort of explore that, and also, how this broader, I guess, oligarch network that also has a lot of ties to the Epstein situation sort of pop up in the record industry with direct connections to Bad Boy Records and Bad Boy Entertainment, and some of these other business ventures of Sean Combs.
Right. And also, I'm not sure how much my audience follows this, but do you mind giving just for people who don't, can you give history of what he's being accused of, the state of the trial, and any relevant information you think it's important to know or understand?
Sure. So I'm not, the series probably isn't going to include stuff that would, sort of be more like court reporting. But as I understand it, he's already had aspects of the legal process have already advanced. And I think his trial is due to start in May. He stands accused of operating what's been called by AP, an empire of sex crimes, sex and human trafficking. A lot of similarities in the charges in some ways to the Epstein and also Ghislaine Maxwell cases. But what's interesting, though, is that, whereas with Epstein and Maxwell, it was sort of the FBI and SDNY leading, the Diddy case has had a lot of involvement from the Department of Homeland Security, which is kind of unusual, it seems.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting also as a native New Yorker, it was interesting to hear about the different places he had like gone to school and lived and moved. And then we'll get it when we talk about Epstein. I don't know if you know what high school I went to, but guess what high school I went to?
Oh, the same one as him. Or where he taught.
Yeah, exactly. Dalton. And that's where Barr was and everything. Your article not only kind of details his violent and abusive rise, but his mentors who helped him, who kind of molded him, such as Clive Davis and Russell Simmons. Can you tell us more about these figures and kind of, I guess, the network behind them?
Yeah. So Clive Davis in particular is the person that is really credited with allowing Bad Boy Records to be a success because, they really wanted to have been successful if they didn't enter into that very early distribution and promo deal with Clive Davis's Arista Records, when they were created. And this is also true of, his mentor, Andre Harrell at Uptown Records. Uptown Records wanted to have been successful if it wasn't for their distribution deal with MCA, for example, which is now Universal Studios. I think the same is true for Russell Simmons' label Def Jam, but I think in their case it was CBS Records, which is also related to sort of the Clive Davis story. Clive Davis was, at sort of the at a major post within the CBS recording subsidiaries. He got involved in this major payola scandal, which is basically generally payola is when there's bribery to get, singles of a particular artist or a particular label played more on certain stations, which is illegal. But in the case of Clive Davis, it was payola basically tied to a heroin ring. And his top assistant, his main aide, was known for sort of being a fixer at the label and supplying, these stations they were, allegedly bribing, and also just other people, artists, under the label and whatever with drugs, with prostitutes, with all sorts of things. Clive Davis arguably evaded charges for that. He got let go of CBS. Why it was kind of hot. The investigation, arguably because they didn't want any of the scandal beyond the payola aspect to come back and bite the company in the butt, basically. And it was that heroin ring, by the way, was tied to organized crime interests. Mainly, I believe the Genovese crime family, which had kind of a long and storied history in the music industry through Roulette Records and figures like Morris Levy, who, for example, funded the first hip hop label, Sugar Hill. And so, there's basically been this unorganized crime effort to dominate those particular labels for some time. And Davis stands accused of people that were once close to, Colms and later became rivals, like Suge Knight, and also his former bodyguard Gene Deal, of sort of training Diddy in this using drugs and sex to control people. Right. And also allegedly Russell Simmons of Def Jam engaged in that same type of behavior and sort of mentored Diddy in that, because Russell Simmons was obviously important, not just for Diddy, but also for Andre Harrell at Uptown Records. And that's how, Diddy, Sean Combs, first entered the music industry. And Russell Simmons is interesting for a few reasons. One of the reasons I point out that it hasn't really gotten a lot of coverage is his very early connection in the 1990s. Obviously, Def Jam was successful by then. He became very involved with this guy who later became a famous Hollywood director named Brett Ratner, who, along with Simmons, has been accused of committing sex crimes. And so now Simmons is in Indonesia evading charges, and Ratner immigrated to Israel to avoid lawsuits related to sex assault. They're both accused separately and accused of engaging in that type of activity together. And Ratner's kind of an interesting figure, at least in recent years, because he teamed up with Steve Mnuchin's Hollywood studio to create, through his company he created with the Australian billionaire James Packer, Rat Pack Entertainment. James Packer is a major focus of the Netanyahu corruption trial currently. A lot of that is, kind of mentioned in the piece, but there's a lot there to pick on. And Ratner was basically offered the opportunity to immigrate to Israel, apparently by Netanyahu, because a week before he did so, he was Netanyahu's a guest of honor at the UN alongside Alan Dershowitz, the former Epstein defense lawyer. So quite an interesting array of special guests to have at your UN speech. And Ratner and Packer were actually recently at Mar-a-Lago dining with Musk and Trump. And apparently Ratner is trying to make his Hollywood comeback after being banished basically because of all the litany of sex assault claims against him. He's directing the new Melania Trump documentary that's supposed to air on Amazon at the end of the year, on which Melania is an executive producer. So
that'll be really objective.
Yeah, and then oddly, around the same time, James Packer buys this property neighboring Mar-a-Lago in Florida that had previously been reserved for like the Secret Service and close friends of the Trump family. So interesting that a major figure in the Netanyahu corruption trial, who became Netanyahu's neighbor, and that's part of what the charge is about, is now kind of repeating the same thing. And one of the reasons I think Brett Ratner is really interesting and his team up with Russell Simmons is interesting is because Brett Ratner is very much involved with sort of the heir to Mayor Lansky, Al Malnick, who's this Miami businessman who's basically credited, by mainstream media too, as inventing this way for Lansky and sort of other mobster bank figures like Tibor Rosenbaum, developing these ways to sort of launder money for organized crime from illicit into legitimate ventures, and created these banks in the Bahamas and all of that to do so. And Ratner is their adopted son and adopted father. They're like very, very, very close. They have a lot of weird ties also, the two of them, to Michael Jackson's final years. And according to Jackson, an attempt to sort of take away his stake in the Beatles music catalog, and a lot of really weird industry stuff there. But basically, the ties to organized crime are pretty extensive. Brett Ratner claims to have been walked home from school in middle school personally by Lansky. Doesn't really make a lot of sense, but that's his claim, and his ties to Al Malnick are kind of significant. So, in looking at a lot of these figures, there seem to be a lot of organized crime ties. And honestly, and I try and make this pretty clear in my book as well, organized crime, despite the public perception that's been developed, did not magically disappear in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. Arguably, it went in, the organized crime figures rebranded as philanthropists and as multinational corporations and as oligarchs. And because of this system that was developed allegedly by Malnick, but also others, they're able to sort of launder money from illicit into these legitimate ventures. And so that illicit money pumps up these legitimate ventures and allows them to become hugely successful and dominate their respective industries, among other things, or buy out competitors and consolidate. And because of, a lot of the legislation that was passed in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton eras, and so on, industry consolidation was allowed to progress to points that were previously unthinkable in the United States, creating, basically quasi semi-monopolies in a lot of our industries to the benefit of a relatively small clique of oligarchs who dominate the country now.